This Silmarillion chat is going to be about Valaquenta, which is the second section of the Silmarillion, because the way that it's published is that there's the Ainulindale. I did a chat for that last week. The Valaquenta, then the main Silmarillion, then the Akalabeth, and the of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. So the Valaquenta is the second and last of the two big mythical sections, we'll call them. By that I mean really prehistorical sections of Middle-earth. Because the Quenta is, you can, there is a way you can date it. You know, you can talk about the years of the trees, you can talk about the years after the trees, things like that. Whereas before, we're talking about the time where Eru is making angels and making the world, and there's stuff basically all to do with the angels, and they're the only characters going on. And the Valaquenta is the account of the Valar and the Maiar according to the law of the Elder, and that's the high angels who are sort of like gods, and also the Maiar, who are the common and garden angels, if you know what I mean. They're similar stuff. They're also angels, but they are lower in order, and they are never spoken of with the same sort of sense of ownership of things. The idea that these other Valar have great ownership of, and portfolios of power and dominion, and the Maiar are much more specialised and just go into one of their sections underneath the dominion of a Valar. We had a good conversation about this on the Discord. You can still join us. I think there's a dedicated gang. I think there might be 7 or 8 of us talking through it. The Valar are the great among the spirits. The elves named the Valar, and the lords of the Valar are 7, and the Valia, the queens of the Valar, are 7 also. And there is the 15th, Melkor, whose name is not spoken upon earth. He's the 8th Lord, but he's not spoken. His name is not spoken upon earth. So there are 15. We've heard about Melkor in the previous chapter. Now, what I guess that some of the biggest things that came up for me whilst reading this, there's a few things, and other people brought some of this up too. One, there's a tonal thing, stylistic thing, compared to the Ainulindale particularly. 2, there's an interest when we think of it as prehistory. I mean, no one reads the Silmarillion first, but if they did, you'd see it as foreshadowing. It becomes a retro-shadowing, doesn't it, or something, when we read it afterward. But these things that point forward, particularly to the Lord of the Rings, things that really kind of course, that's one thing, is that when we know the complex textual history of things, and we'll get to some of that in this video, I think, we know how much, even in the 30s, in the writing of The Hobbit and at the start of Rings, there's this interplay of what has already been written that's in Tolkien's mind. For instance, I am reading The Hobbit with my kids at the moment, and they've got to Rivendell, and Elrond has identified, I think he's identified Glamdring as the sword of the King of Gondolin, or something like the sword of the King of Gondolin, which of course is his great-grandfather, Turgon, which is, very, by that point, he knows, I don't know if he knew the family tree at that point, there's probably something like it out there though, by the 30s, but he knows about the story of Gondolin, which is a very early story that he wrote in the Trenches originally, the fall of Gondolin. So there's this complex relationship there. So it's not fake foreshadowing. However, one thing, there is an editorial thing going on, which I've compared to History of Middle-earth to check, which I'll touch on. So yeah, it's stylistic, foreshadowing, and there's still some big thematic things as well about the way Tolkien sees his world, but his world, starting with stylistic. A couple of people pointed out there's a contrast between the Ainulindale in style, which is very mythical, and the Valaquenta, which is much more like a list, and just these are these gods or angels, they do this. And one person compared it to how Genesis 1 and 2 in the Jewish and Christian Bibles have this very different tone of a more poetic versus more historical, in terms of, by that I mean presented as these are the facts of the matter. That was one comparison. Another was that it was mythical versus kind of, I guess, more, how this, I think how Tony put it, it was put down more factually so that it's easier to understand. Some of the stuff you've heard about there, this is just actually what happened. These are the guys who are involved. And though I think that received mixed reception in our discussion, I think it's interesting, and it's something where you probably wouldn't want a whole book written like a list of things. But I think it's interesting that there is just this. By the way, these are the major characters at the heavenly level. There's never an equivalent in the surviving documents, really, of earthly characters, nor perhaps should there. But there is this kind of, this is the prehistory. These are the major characters who aren't God, Eru, but they are acting in place of the gods. I'll move on to this thematic thing actually next, and then back to the foreshadowing and some of the editorial stuff. But yeah, the thematic stuff, one thing that I've picked up a bit over both, here there are two phrases which are very important in terms of the theology of Lord of the Rings. By that I mean, what do people in Lord of the Rings think about the world? There is one other Lord of the Rings event I'd attach to this, but it's not mentioned here. One is that we hear that Ilúvatar gave to their vision the vision of the Inner Being and set it amid the void, and the secret fire was sent to burn at the heart of the world, and it was called Ea. The secret fire is sort of the life and energy of the world, but it's also at some level a metonym for Eru Ilúvatar. It's representative of him. It's his active power, you could say, and he therefore you could see it as, when you say the secret fire, it's God, it's Eru. Now what does Gandalf say? I'm the servant of the secret fire. It's a point there when he says that, he's saying, because he doesn't mean I'm there on behalf of an abstract life power, not even the Valar, but just an abstract life power. He means he's there on behalf of Eru. You also get Varda, the Lady of the Stars, who is also known as Elbereth, and she is most feared by Melkor, we are told. And that's a really interesting point. That was a point Clarkey particularly brought up. This idea, partly thematically, you get this big kind of, let's call it, the idea of deep order in the universe. And you get that on the top of, and this isn't irrelevant at all because it's stars, the top of Cirith Ungol when Sam looks up and sees the stars. The idea there's deep order in the stars. You've already had some of that in the Ainur Dale. That shows you the universe is ordered even if things seem bad here below. It also, theologically, it means that we know we must think of Elbereth, Agathoniel. This is obvious if you kind of have some sense of what's going on in those texts, but it's prayerful, isn't it? It's at some level directed to the stars and talking about the stars, and therefore, because it is the name of Varda, to Varda, calling for aid. The third point, which won't come up really, until the Akalabeth, but is that the third of these theology in Lord of the Rings is that Faramir and his soldiers say, they don't say anything, but they do grace by facing west to lost Númenor, and beyond that to a man. And that, of course, is also representative of Eru's power and the respect due to him. So thematically, that's some of it. The idea of deep order, the idea of, and particularly that also is something which terrifies Melkor, and therefore will later terrify the servants of Sauron. Another thematic point a couple of people brought up is how Aule and Melkor are paired, and one is, and there's a Bombadilish thing here. Aule, this is one reason actually why you can see the Aule Bombadil theory is not a very strong theory, I think, but you can see it because Aule at some level is this creativity and craft and masterwork, but constrained by virtue and by an understanding of role. Whereas Melkor cannot accept limitation. That's his whole problem. He gets very offended and he goes around marring. And a big thing that comes up in the Valaquenta is how much he mars Middle-earth, and this is according to this volume of the History of Middle-earth, is a later development post Rings. This will lead to our third final point, but it's a development post or during Rings that Melkor theologically is the root of corruption. He doesn't cause immediately every sin, or whatever you want to call them, You know, he doesn't cause everybody to do bad things, but the way in which there's corruption, it comes from his role in the music of the Aina, which we talked about last time. This leads to an interesting observation, hence the title of this one, Morgoth's Ring, that Sauron makes a ring, the ring of power, but the whole of Arda was Morgoth's ring, so said Tolkien. This idea that he put himself in and was trapped in and was corrupted by, in the sense he was trapped by, the whole of creation. Someone pointed out, though, this was Tony, I think, particularly the idea that Aule, there is a fixing role that Aule plays. That's a really interesting image or picture, isn't it, I think? At least I think so. A really interesting picture of how, for Tolkien, the difficulty and tragedy of the world is perhaps in some small way sometimes fixed. Melkor was jealous of Aule, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers. If you can't be constrained by virtue and by self-fulfillment, like Bombadil is, you're contained in yourself, therefore Bombadil doesn't need to be anyone's master. You have to be master of other things. You're spread outside yourself into a ring or into Arda. There was long strife between them, in which Melkor ever marred or undid the works of Aule, and Aule grew weary in repairing them. Both also desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill. But Aule remained faithful to Eru and submitted all that he did to his will, and he did not envy the works of others, but sought and gave counsel. Whereas Melkor spent his spirit in envy and hate, until at last he could make nothing save in mockery of the thought of others, and all their works be destroyed if he destroyed if he could. So Aule makes things and repairs things. It's tiring, depressing, but he keeps doing it, I guess. Melkor, because he becomes less and less creative, we hear in the Ainul Andale, he's eventually trapped in one form because of this, and it's not an attractive form. His desire for power destroys his ability to actually have real power, sub-creative power. The final point on foreshadowing, we've got some issues of foreshadowing already in what I've said, the Secret Fire and Elbereth, and we also have, and this is most importantly it's mentioned in a couple of places, I guess one is mentioned in the main Valar section as well, and then another in Of the Maiar, but one, the idea that the sea, I know in fact that's in Ainul Andale, and then in Of the Maiar, I think, to do with, is it Osse or is it when Ulmo is mentioned again? Yeah, it's when Ulmo is mentioned again, that the sound of the sea is so appealing to those who live beside it or who have heard it, and that's partly because Ulmo is there, and partly, and this is really the same thing, because the music of the Aina is purest in the sea. It is least changed or affected. So when the elf hears the sea, they hear the creation song, and that's where they're tempted to go west, re Legolas. You have the stuff about Elbereth, you have the stuff about the Secret Fire, and then you have also Of the Maiar and of the enemies. Well, say of the enemies, let's go there. We hear that dreadful among those spirits who were corrupted by Morgoth were the Valarorkor, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called Balrogs, demons of terror. Relevant, of course, when we're thinking about the Gondolin reference in The Hobbit, that, Balrogs fall with Melkor, and of course, when we're thinking about the Balrog himself in Moria. And among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was that spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthor the Cruel. In his beginning he was of the Mire of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth, and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. That is the last line. So you have Sauron set up, and the discussion we had, and I'll get to my last of these references because it's a fun one, but the discussion we had was there are so many things here which reference the Rings trilogy. This must either exist more or less in completeness after or during the Rings, or it must have been edited from a different text and scattered things to become one text by Christopher Tolkien. In fact, what we find out in Morgoth's ring is that the later versions, the last version, in fact, that really existed in that form of the Quenta Silmarillion, is the late 50s, which there's a thing which goes on with the writing, that he has lots of writing up to 37 and he moves on to rings. He then is writing some alongside rings in the 40s into the early 50s, and then stops because there's no chance for getting published, so he focuses on rings instead. And then he does write up until 1973 or whatever. He continues to write to get stuff about the Silmarillion going, but though there are some full versions of some texts, it becomes a lot more scattered and disparate and incomplete. There's no version of that you could say this is what he thought in 1973. And some of his last speculations are ones that we know Christopher Tolkien just basically ignored in the Silmarillion book, not in the History of Middle-earth, but in the published version, like, oh, actually the world was never flat, because that couldn't really have happened, could it? Which I think, by the way, was a flawed line of reasoning on his part. But the point was, he was thinking in directions that never settled from the late 50s when he started back on it through to the early 70s when he died. But the Valaquenta specifically, this was the point, is something that just exists in two versions very similar to each other from the late 50s, which are what is printed in here. So there is no text of it here, you're just referred to that and given notes on how he'd edited it and things. And that says a lot, I think, about what had happened, that the Valaquenta was reacting to the world of the rings and things that he thought mattered, and that would set up, therefore, a prequel. You know, here is, you've got The Hobbit, you've got The Lord of the Rings, here is the book, or set of books, basically the books that are in here, that bridge the gap from the creation through to The Hobbit, let's say, and indeed, because of the Rings of Power and the Third Age is in here, all the way to the end of Lord of the Rings as well. A complete history of Middle-earth. And so, of course, he mentions Sauron. He mentions Melian the Maya in there as well, which doesn't set up Lord of the Rings, but does set up Silmarillion. It's important. He picks out important characters, and therefore, I'll finish here with this. He also says, wisest of the Maiar was a Lorin. He too dwelt in Lorien. Someone pointed out that, of course, there you've got the intentional, not echo, but repetition between the earthly Lorien and the heavenly. But his ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and the Lady of Tears, and of her he learned pity and patience. And this is a little Easter egg I found out only tonight while checking the text. We also hear of a Lorin, this thing that he says was wrongly omitted from the Silmarillion. He wrongly omitted it, Christopher Tolkien admits. He adds, he was humble in the land of the blessed, and in Middle-earth he sought no renown. His triumph was in the uprising of the fallen, and his joy was in the renewal of hope. Which I think Chris indicates that he left it out because his father had added inverted commas, but obviously that indicates it's a saying, not that he was deleting it. But what a wonderful phrase about Gandalf, a Lorin. It's interesting, Curanir, Saruman, doesn't come up. He's not relevant in the same way. But a Lorin is the wisest and kindest from the beginning, it seems, of the Maiar. And so it becomes natural, and this really is, at some level, has to be seen as retrospective because it's the version he wrote at that point. He then is obviously the candidate for but for being the kind of key helper of the peoples of the West in the Third Age. That was my reading of the Valaquenta. That was some of our discussion. I'd love to hear extra thoughts of yours. Put them in the comments. We'll be moving on to the main Quenta this coming week. So, as I say, you're still welcome to join the Discord. Till next time.